welcome to the 2021 Regents Cup competition. We are so glad you are here to celebrate free speech and civil discourse at our state's universities. I am proud to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Keith E. Whittington, the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton University. Professor Whittington is also the author of Speak Freely: Why We Must Defend Free Speech on Our Nation's Campuses, which won the Prose Award for Best Book in Education. It is also required reading for all freshmen at Princeton University. Joining him today is Robert Shibley, Executive Director of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, also known as FIRE. During his career at FIRE, Robert has aided students and faculty members at hundreds of colleges and universities to educate them about First Amendment issues on campuses across the country. Arizona's 3 universities have all earned FIRE's highest green rating for free speech, and Arizona has become the only state where all of its public institutions have earned this coveted rating. I hope you enjoy their informative and lively conversation about free speech on our nation's college campuses.
Thanks for joining us today. My name is Robert Shibley. I'm the Executive Director of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit group that works in the favor of and on behalf of free speech, due process, academic freedom, and fundamental fairness on America's colleges and universities. I'm very glad to be here for Arizona's public universities to host this keynote speech for the Regents Cup, a really one-of-a-kind opportunity for students to come together to debate these issues and to engage in a really a free speech debate and dialogue. So I'd like to start by asking you, Professor Whittington, over the last year or so, free speech has been in the news more often than I can remember during my lifetime. I'm 42 years old, thanks to the high-profile fights over what to do about controversial speech by political officials, including the former president, as well as by everyday citizens on social media platforms. So with all that's going on, why should we as a nation and why should students in particular be worried about campus free speech these days? And why does free speech matter on university campuses?
Well, it's certainly the case that there are lots of other things going on in America and in the world to worry about, but I do think free speech is on the list of things we ought to be concerned about. And as you just noted, it's not just an issue on college campuses, but increasingly is an issue all through American society generally. There are some specific debates associated with the college campus context, but I think in general, these broader principles of free speech are critically important to think about throughout American society, and then also in our context of university campuses. For American society as a whole, we particularly care about free speech because of its relationship to democracy. That in order to have a functioning democracy, you need the average citizen to be able to criticize government officials, criticize government policy, to think about what the alternatives are to the incumbents, and think about alternative policies and alternative candidates who might be running for office. We want that debate not just to be an elite debate that happens in the chamber of Congress. We want that to be a debate that the people as a whole can participate in. And if people are going to be able to make good decisions about who to vote for, what policy support, what direction they want the country to go in, they need to hear the arguments about what the right ideas are and be able to hash through the disagreements that we have over what the future ought to look like. On college campuses, there is some concern about that kind of democratic functioning of free speech, and that's also important. College campuses are important incubators for thinking about ideas. They're going to matter for democracy as a whole. They're places where students learn to be better citizens, so we want to have those values reflected on college campuses as well. But it's also true that college campuses are particularly concerned with trying to advance human knowledge. And it turns out that very similar free speech principles that matter for how democracy works also matter for how you advance human knowledge and communicate what it is we know. That is, as scholars, we need to be able to ask difficult questions about controversial topics. We need to be able to teach those materials to our students and be able to communicate in the classroom what controversial issues scholars are thinking about and trying to get students to grapple with those issues. We need to be able to communicate with other scholars about what our findings are on those controversial topics. And ultimately, we need to be able to communicate that to the wider public, because you hope that things you learn on college campuses can ultimately be shared with the society more generally. So all that requires the ability to have a pretty free-ranging, robust debate about ideas on college campus as well. And we ought to be very nervous about those who would want to come in and limit and suppress the ability to have that kind of conversation on a college campus, just like we ought to be nervous about people wanting to define tight limits on what kind of debates we can have in a democracy.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. As you know, and as First Amendment attorneys know, and many folks who are into the free speech world know, the understanding of the First Amendment has not always been what it is today. And the Supreme Court's understanding of the scope of those free speech protections has actually expanded dramatically over time from a legal perspective. Can you tell us a little bit about how we got there?
Yeah, it's certainly understandable. I think that students are working with a limited time horizon as they think about free speech controversies. They think about the kinds of controversies that have risen during their lifetime or when they're particularly paying attention. They worry about the immediate controversies they find themselves involved in or that they wind up caring about. But that's a tiny little window into how free speech is operated in the United States, who benefits from free speech, what the kinds of controversies and topics are. We need a longer time horizon to think about the broader context when we really think about what are the principles of free speech that matter and why do they matter. And it's important to think about how we did get here to this point. If you look at free speech principles as they were embodied in American constitutional law in the 19th century, for example, they were much more restrictive about what kinds of liberties people had. It was very common that if speakers were trying to speak to an audience and issuing public controversial opinions that members of the audience might disagree with, it'd be the speaker who'd get arrested for disturbing the peace by riling up the audience with all these controversial ideas. It's only in the 20th century that really starts to change, and really it takes decades over the course of the 20th century that we gradually open up the space for more free speech. And a lot of the pressure for opening things up and giving more legal protections to free speech came from dissenters, often from the progressive movement, people from the left who are pressing for changes in the status quo. They need to get their message out. They need to have the freedom to critique those who currently occupy power. And as a consequence, they need freedom from protection from those who occupy power who might want to suppress and restrict their speech in various ways. So we saw socialists and anarchists making these arguments at the beginning of the 20th century, where they were often being arrested on the grounds that their speech was too dangerous to be able to communicate that to the broader public. The Supreme Court gradually expanded the amount of protection that people in those situations could expect from American constitutional law, and restricted the context in which the government could try to suppress speech as being too dangerous for American audiences to hear. In the mid-20th century, we had an expansion of protections for literature and works of art, which was particularly surrounding debates over obscenity and how expansive the definition of obscenity could be. In particular, there are a number of works that are now routinely taught in literature departments as being classics of 20th century American literature or world literature more generally, that routinely were being banned by American government officials, and the law as it was designed at the time allowed that. And so part of what we saw in the mid-20th century, extending well into the 1960s and 1970s, was a greater expansion of speech, not only for these kind of political dissidents, but also for these cultural dissidents who wanted to shake up American life and get people to be thinking more broadly about the world, and courts increasingly giving space to people to make those kinds of arguments, and tying the hands of government officials who might want to censor and suppress and restrict the range of arguments, the range of ideas, the range of cultural expression that could be put in front of American citizens.
Yeah, one of the issues and the way that we think about that, I think the thing is that it's occurred to me that I need to be conscious of as a free speech advocate, and that I think also those who are opposed to the kind of free speech that those of us who would be sort of maximalists in that area need to consider, is that when we're thinking about the kind of controversial or abhorrent speech that we think about all the time. We hear about it, particularly, when you see this person was kicked off of Twitter for saying this or whatever it is. It's very hard to defend that kind of speech. And you kind of find yourself wondering, and I think a lot of people find themselves wondering what it is, like, how could that speech possibly be something that would warrant protection? It's not the same as abolitionist speech, or it's not the same as a socialist or even a communist back in the 1950s or 60s. How could this ever have any kind of merit? And one of the things that is very difficult, even for me, is doing this as my job to consider, is that I'm a person of my time too. Like to the extent that it seems to me like that, I'm defending things that I can't really imagine them catching on or turning out to be something that we, could get something out of. That's the same way that people were operating when they were banning abolitionist speech. They, I'm sure many of them thought that might lead to a civil war. If they did, they were correct, right? Same with other kinds of speech. And so I think it's important to remember, for all of us to remember, that we really are creatures of our time when it comes to that. Like you said, I think the developing definition of obscenity over the years, I mean, what it was applied to, I guess the famous book Lady Chatterley's Lover and Lolita and books like that they seem fair. I mean, obviously you can understand why people thought they were obscene, they had sexual content, etc., but seem very tame to, I think, modern eyes. And so trying to put yourself in the position of people at that time and see, what would I be arguing then, I think could be a very valuable tool for people.
I think having broader context and bearing in mind that we exist within particular context makes a difference. That it's easy for us to discount how intense the debates were about some of the past speech, because from our perspective, it may seem relatively tame. It may seem relatively obvious that ought to be protected. It wasn't obvious to them. And likewise, there's plenty of speech now that we're fighting over that's not, that is going to be taken for granted one way or another 20 years from now. But for us, it's still uncertain as to what degree it ought to be protected. I think the other things to think about, though, beyond sort of that one feature of civil libertarian approaches and defenses of free speech in general is you do find yourself trying to defend particular examples of speech that are often not very attractive. People who are being very inflammatory, people who are engaging in speech that is not very informative and doesn't seem to advance our understanding of the world or our political understanding of how policy works in a very informed way. And yet, nonetheless, I think it's critical to defend people even in those kinds of situations, even when we're not necessarily convinced that the specific content of these particular instances of speech are high value examples of speech. I mean, partially we ought to worry about what it means for empowering government officials to make those decisions as to which speech is low value, which speech is high value, which one can be suppressed and which one can't. You can't easily empower them to suppress the things that you don't like and that we might think are genuinely of low value, and not have it be much more sweeping and not have it have consequences for other speech. And so it's critical, I think, to try to defend the general principle of free speech, even in these contexts where we disagree with the speaker, we don't necessarily value what the particular speaker's engaged in, because defending it on those margins ultimately becomes critically important to maintaining a reserve of free speech at the very core of the things we do care about a great deal and need to protect.
What do you think have been, over this development, what do you think the implications have been for student speech over the years? Obviously, the University of 2020 is not the same as the University of 1920 in a lot of different ways. What have those implications, how have they begun to apply to students?
Yeah, well, certainly we've seen it both in the context of changes in constitutional doctrine about how much for legal protection students have, but we also certainly have seen it in the changes in culture on campuses and what that winds up looking like. Notably, again, out of these same movements that are trying to drive greater protections for free speech in general that are occurring, especially in the mid-20th century, that winds up having spillover effects for thinking about students in particular. And so you see examples of college students who are joining civil rights protests, for example, and are being threatened with expulsion from their schools as a consequence of their protest activities, and courts sweeping in to protect them and say that that kind of activity is constitutionally protected, and as a consequence, they can't be disciplined by their schools for having engaged in that kind of activity in a way that would have been taken for granted by university administrators 10 or 20 years previous to that. Classically, in a case involving high school students, the Tinker case involved a student who was engaged in a protest of the Vietnam War by wearing a black armband that was not particularly obtrusive or disruptive for the school. Again, the traditional view would have been, well, students in a high school have no speech rights whatsoever that a principal might have to worry about. And the court comes in and says, look, even students, even minors who are in a public school have some free speech rights as long as they're not disruptive to the operation of the school. That ought to be protected, and the principal can't simply punish them for making that kind of demonstration and expression of their political beliefs. There's been obviously a lot of development since then of trying to think about how do you balance that issue of how does the school function effectively so that people expressing their views are not disruptive on the one hand, and on the other hand, allowing space for students to express themselves. As you might expect, it's more restrictive in a high school context, middle school context, than it would be in a university context. One thing about universities is we are trying to give people, I think, a lot more protection, a lot more space to engage in a wide range of free speech and expression. And the opportunities for disrupting the operation of the larger campus are much more limited in that context than would tend to be true at high schools. And so we have gradually learned that, and the court has insisted that there ought to be more protections for students. Students have often been on the leading edge of insisting that they ought to have additional free speech rights and ought to be recognized and protected in exercising those speech rights. And that's been true even at lower levels, but it's been especially true at the university level, and has really opened up university campuses to be much more expansive free speech zones for student speech than would have been true, for example, when my parents first started college in the early 1960s.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking of my parents' experience, not a speech thing, but I remember that at the University of Tennessee in the late 1960s, men and women had separate dorms, and men could go out and there was no curfew or anything, but women could only go out, I think Friday and Saturday night, had to be signed out, had to sign back in at a certain time. And if you didn't make it back, you would actually lose your privileges to go out the next weekend. So it's sort of unthinkable I can't imagine any public universities certainly, but almost any private university doing that nowadays. But it is, I think, a really good tool to think about those sorts of things. You're looking back and seeing just how big some of those battles for student free speech was. They weren't, fooling around on the margins in some cases. They were, really asking for real changes to the way that students were seen as people who participate fully in our democracy. And of course, the change to the 18-year-old voting age, I think, made that even clearer, as, if your argument is that, and it often is, that students aren't responsible enough to be allowed to engage in all kinds of speech, particularly political speech, it's very difficult to continue making that argument. We also ask them to make political decisions. Like you said, this is if we're going to have an informed democracy, we need the voters to be able to engage in that kind of thing. And there's really no reason to have a class of under 21, between 18 and 21-year-old voters who aren't full participants, but whose vote counts just as much as the next person. So, it's important to preserve that on those college campuses.
It's really informative to go back and look at some of these cases that started emerging in the 1950s and extend well into the 1980s, in particular, in sort of just making this fundamental transformation of how universities operate in ways I think the current students find it hard to imagine. And so this example of men's and women's dorms, and women having to be signed out to go out on some nights, and men having a great deal more freedom. My parents always tell me these stories about the women's dorm closing an hour before the men's dorm so that the women had to be back first, and the like. And so there's just radical differences about how the campuses operate, and that spread into the area of student speech as well. And so the same kind of university administrators who imagine, well, of course we ought to have these kinds of regulations to monitor how students are behaving more generally, also took the view, for example, that students couldn't just write anything they wanted in a student newspaper and hand it out on Parents' Day when alumni or parents or prospective students might be visiting, and universities universities were routinely trying to censor student speech in those contexts in order to try to make sure that the university was put in its best light when these kind of constituencies came along. And often you wound up having to have litigation in order for courts to tell universities you can't control what students are going to print in their newspapers and hand out to parents when they're visiting campus. That's beyond the control of a university president. I find students are shocked to discover that public universities routinely banned pro-gay rights student groups in the 1970s and even into the 1980s, often on the grounds that the underlying activity they were advocating was in fact illegal in those states. And so in that context where universities felt quite free to say, look, we ought to have a strong hand to control what students are talking about, how they talk about them, exclude certain kinds of speakers and activities and groups and newspapers that students might want to engage in. Those battles that opened up that space now, students just take for granted. And you should be very cautious then about trying to reopen that door and say, well, actually let's impose some more restrictions to imagine that can be easily controlled and you won't find yourself refighting exactly the same battles that previous generation of students had to fight in order to gain this kind of freedom.
Well, it's a good segue to my next question, which is, what do you think are the main threats to student speech rights today?
In some ways, I think it's the same as it always was. Overzealous campus administrators, university administrators who want to protect the image of campus, want to avoid controversies for their campus, and are particularly aggressive then in trying to restrict student speech for the sake of those other values. I think what they're worried about as potentially embarrassing the campus or creating controversies has changed to some degree. So it's a different set of student speech that causes concern, but I think there's a very similar instinct on the part of university administrators that anytime there's going to be a controversy that might threaten to put the university in a bad public light, to invite legislators or alumni or donors or parents to be nervous about the college, that the instinct of university administrators is try to shut that down and stop that kind of controversial speech if they can. One thing I think has changed to some degree is sort of where some of the pressure on university administrators is coming from in order to shut down speech. So as I mentioned, through the late 20th century and into the early 21st century, the pressure from students was often loosening speech and give us more freedom to engage in the speech that we want to engage in, and pushing back against campus administrators in order to carve out more space for themselves. Now, increasingly, I think you do see students encouraging administrators to come in and intervene in these speech controversies, to shut down speech in various ways, shut down their opponent's speech in various ways that I really don't think we saw very much of in past decades, but I think we're seeing a lot more of now. What you would hope is the campus administrators would be the adults in the room and would recognize what their responsibilities are as campus administrators, as university leaders, as people at public universities, for example, who have to respect the constitutional rights of students. You would hope they would stand up to some of these pressures and simply explain what the actual commitments are here and not give in and try to suppress speech. But they don't always. Sometimes they find it easier to reach in and try to suppress the speech rather than try to explain why we actually value speech on a college campus.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that the folks most likely to be listening to this speech, this discussion, are likely to be students or people who deal with the schools in the University of Arizona system, or Arizona's university system. And Arizona is actually very unusual. It's one of the very few states that actually all of the state universities that fire goes through and rates red, yellow, or green based on their respect for free speech and their written policies. Arizona is one of maybe one or two states that is all green light schools, which is really commendable. I think it's great that the universities have made that commitment to go through their policies and say, we're not going to have any policies that are that can be reasonably be used in order to censor our students' speech. It used to be when fire started to rate schools as a red light, which is sort of laughably unconstitutional speech codes, a yellow light, which is too many codes that can too easily be used to abuse students' free speech, and green light, which is no codes that could reasonably be used to violate student free speech. 79% of schools were red in about 2008. That's down to about 20% now, and the number of green light schools has gone from about 7 or 8 schools in the United States to more than 50. So there's been progress on that. But there's very few places like the state of Arizona where you have all the state university system schools having that green light rating. And so, I think that's a commendable commitment that schools have made. But you're right, there's a lot, I think particularly because of social media, there's a lot more pressure now on administrators, whether it be from actual students of the school or students of other schools, or just people on Twitter, was on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, is the old New Yorker cartoon. And you can't really tell on Twitter who is pressuring you and who's telling you to do this, but I think it brings sort of an immediacy and a feeling of crisis to administrators making these decisions that if you get 500 people yelling at you about something, to people, I think that seems really terrifying, and it is. I mean, it's a very scary thing to do. But you think this is a country with 330 million people in it, so it may still not be representative of what most people want. So I think you're right. I mean, we certainly have seen an uptick in sort of student pressure that is used to ask for more restrictions on speech, generally speech favored by your political opponents. I still don't think it's a very large proportion of students, but I think certainly social media has done a lot to sort of amplify those voices, and that's in Fire's opinion. We like people's voices being amplified. We don't like, and though people have the right to call. And we defend people's right to call for speech restrictions, we don't think those speech restrictions should be applied. And so sometimes it is going to be incumbent on administrators, faculty members, and other people at universities to make a decision that is going to seem unpopular. Whether or not it is unpopular with everybody is harder to tell, but there's certainly going to be a lot of pressure, and I think that's a new kind, maybe not a new kind of pressure, but there certainly seems a new scale of that pressure on college administrators.
Yeah, and you just made a point that I think is really important and worth amplifying a little bit more, which is it's easy to imagine that the number of voices calling for suppression and speech on campus is extraordinarily large, and often it is a fairly small but extremely vocal minority calling for these kinds of speech restrictions. And it's easy for a student then to walk onto a campus and hear these kind of cries for restricting speech and just assume that's what everybody thinks. And I think one of the challenges for those who actually would like to see a more robust free speech environment on college campuses and like to see it preserved is that it's easy to lose sight of just how many students are actually still quite supportive of having expansive free speech, because they're not the noisy ones at the moment. There were times when the people making lots of noise on this issue precisely were the free speech advocates. Now it's often the people making lots of noise are the ones who want to suppress speech in various ways. And I think students shouldn't be too quick to assume that they're isolated and out of step if they think that there ought to be more speech protections, and they're hearing all these people on campus and off campus calling for restrictions. It's often the case there is a genuine silent majority here of people who are not so loudly entering into these debates, but who actually would prefer a fairly free environment for having debates.
Professor, we're having this discussion in sort of a celebration and an accompaniment of the Regents Cup, which is really a one of its kind or one of a kind experience that is available to folks at the Arizona universities. These are students who are going to be debating on these issues. This really is a celebration of free speech. Do you have any sort of encouraging words that you'd like to give, or sort of advice for the people who are going to be engaging, really getting their hands dirty, so to speak, with free speech and these issues here as part of the competition?
Yeah, no, it's great to see people getting their hands dirty, trying to debate these issues and think them through. And these kinds of venues where students really have an opportunity to explore ideas debate them seriously, engage each other in a respectful but serious fashion, is really a model for how we would like universities to be operating in general. And so not only is the subject matter that they're discussing critically important, but the way in which they're approaching it is critically important and valuable for universities. And so I hope that they will take away from this experience an appreciation of the fun that can be had engaging in these kinds of conversations, as well as what can be gained through having these kind of conversations, and carry that with them to the rest of their university life and experience and career, but also hopefully outside of universities and beyond universities, they can recall back that these kind of conversations are possible, and that we ought to be trying to foster more of them in American society, despite all the pressure sometimes to simply yell at each other rather than actually talk to one another.
I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. I'd like to thank especially Professor Keith Whittington of Princeton University. I'd like to also thank our host, Arizona State University, and all of Arizona's public universities for hosting this really unique competition. The Regents Cup is an exciting opportunity for folks to come together to talk about these important issues. And I want to thank the folks who are making that possible in every way. You folks out in Arizona, you have a great opportunity that most Americans aren't, most American college students don't have right now. And so I really look forward to being with you, and hopefully I can be with you in person next year as well.